The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is an international instrument intended to set the standards to protect pre-existing and inherent human rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide. It focuses on establishing a minimum standard of rights and freedoms and protects their right to self-determination. It includes 46 articles ratified by the UN that ultimately challenge the notion of absolute state sovereignty. However, the final article states, "Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states." While the Declaration affirms Indigenous peoples' right to maintain their own distinct institutions and the right to restitution for stolen lands, they also retain the right to participate fully in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state, and to participate in all decision-making that affects them. I've included a timeline here with significant dates to help you see the Declaration in its larger context here in Canada. In 1982, the Economic and Social Council established the Working Group on Indigenous Populations with the mandate to develop a set of minimum standards that would protect Indigenous people. This was happening at the same time as amendments were being made to the Canadian Constitution and the creation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Significantly, Section 35 was included last minute as part of the Constitution Act in '82, recognizing the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Just a short 25 years later, the UNDRIP was drafted in 2007. At this time, the Declaration was adopted by 143 countries around the world. While 11 abstained and 34 others were absent from discussions, only 4 countries were actually against it. Those 4 countries happened to be Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Canada. The primary concern for Canadians voting against it was that adopting what was included in the Declaration would be in direct conflict with existing Canadian law protecting Indigenous people. In 2010, all 4 countries reversed their position, endorsing it with reservations. It was not until Trudeau's 2015 election campaign that the Liberals pledged to fully adopt and implement the Declaration in order to enact the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2016, after the Liberals were elected, UNDRIP was fully adopted in Canada without reservation. It was seen by many in Parliament as breathing life into Section 35 and recognizing it as a full box of rights for Indigenous people in Canada. A few months later, Trudeau's government approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Prime Minister Trudeau stated that Indigenous opponents don't have a veto. Around the same time, Bill C-262 was presented to the House of Commons with the aim to ensure that the laws of Canada are in harmony with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In 2018, Bill C-262 was passed by the House of Commons on 2 different occasions. However, in the spring of 2019, on National Indigenous Peoples Day, the Senate halted recognition of Bill C-262. They vetoed it, so to speak, guaranteeing that it did not become law. In November of the same year, the BC provincial government passed Bill 41, British Columbia's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, making BC the first Canadian province or territory to commit to implementing the UNDRIP. Because of the federal government's lack of initiative in implementing the Declaration, provinces have been left to take action on their own. The BC government's approach has been focused primarily on developing an action plan alongside First Nations communities by reviewing BC's laws affecting Indigenous people and taking steps to ensure they align with UNDRIP. This all sounds good, and there have definitely been significant steps taken by BC government in order to implement the Declaration. But since its passing, the provincial government, as well as the federal government and other provinces and territories, such as the Northwest Territories, have slowed the speed with which they are taking action. It also seems in many instances that the passing of Bill 41 has not actually eased tensions with the First Nation communities in BC, but has sometimes intensified them. In the case of BC, there are three major things that seem to be at work: the Coastal GasLink pipeline, the LNG plant, and the Site C Dam project. Tom Flanagan, an outspoken conservative political scientist at the U of C, recently described it this way. Ironically for British Columbia, which has taken the lead in legislating UNDRIP, free, prior, and informed consent now threatens its flagship development project, namely the export of liquefied natural gas. If the Coastal GasLink pipeline cannot go through Wet'suwet'en territory, the huge LNG plant at Kitimat cannot be supplied. Site C is also involved because the hydroelectricity from that project is supposed to help power the LNG liquefaction process without carbon dioxide emissions. If the liquefaction process has to be powered by burning natural gas, LNG export will not be nearly as green as the NDP has promised. Once again, climate alarmism and a radical version of Indigenous rights are coming together to threaten the development of natural resources. The BC government was happy to play the game when the target was Alberta oil, but now finds itself on the defensive as a result of its own legislation. Flanagan's intention in writing was definitely to argue that the implementation of UNDRIP in Canadian legislation would lead to nothing more than economic devastation. He argued that legislating it would be as impossible as trying to legislate the Sermon on the Mount. The main issue for most people is related to two articles in the UNDRIP, both of which state the need to obtain Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent in legislative matters or the approval of projects affecting their lands. The main issue is the debate surrounding whether the free, prior, and informed consent should be understood as a right to veto or be understood as consent, meaning that the decision is shared and involves the consultation and cooperative agreement of Indigenous people. Senator Murray Sinclair is one who has argued that the debate surrounding the right to veto misses the point completely. Trudeau's comment in light of the pipeline approval in 2016 is a really good example of the way that this language completely misses the point. If the veto doesn't fall to Indigenous people, then in a real sense, it subsists in the hands of the Canadian government alone. On the other hand, if we begin to truly reimagine this relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada as coexisting nations working towards reconciliation, the veto debate could essentially fall apart. Senator Sinclair recently stated, "Free, prior, and informed consent is a very simple concept, and that is, before you affect my land, you need to talk to me and you need to have my permission. That doesn't mean that we're vetoing it. It doesn't mean that the First Nations people or Indigenous people outside of Indian reserves are vetoing anything. Just because they say you can't run a pipeline across my land doesn't mean you can't run it anywhere else." A recent paper commenting on the effects of COVID-19 draws the conversation back to the reality of the day-to-day lives of many Indigenous communities here in Canada. The authors write, although public health measures such as social distancing and the adoption of hygiene practices have necessarily been the mainstay of Canada's approach to containing coronavirus disease, these measures require people to have housing, water, food, and income security, which are often inadequate in Indigenous communities. The Canadian government's most current justification for the delay in implementing the declaration is the COVID-19 pandemic. But in light of this very situation, we should be treating this as a priority and emergency. Instead, the focus of the media and our conversations surrounding the pandemic have generally been centered on whether or not Mask wearing is an infringement on our freedoms and economic concerns. There has been widespread support of the UNDRIP by Canadian churches. The Anglican Church sees free, prior, and informed consent as being about creating a starting point for mutual respect. Several churches in Canada, including the United Church, have actively engaged in support of passing Bill C-262 and are actively taking steps to educate their congregants. In general, the focus in Canadian churches has been on creating and supporting awareness in the church and advocating for the passing of UNDRIP into legislation. Senator Murray Sinclair has said many times that education got us into this mess and education will get us out of this mess. Focusing on education is definitely one of the steps, if not the main step, the church has taken in addressing these issues. Yet it seems that no matter how much we learn about them, they don't go away. I've been wondering if the way Senator Sinclair understands education might be different than the way that I do, that the Canadian churches do. In the same way that Indigenous people understand their relationship to the land differently, as a reciprocal relationship, rather than something to be owned, exploited, and used to ensure economic capital. In New Zealand, they have begun to explore different ways of understanding the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. They've increasingly begun to see the Crown as not only representative of non-Indigenous people, but Indigenous people as well. From their perspective, the Crown is understood as an inclusive, unifying institution. Seeing this relationship between the Crown and Indigenous people as binary separates Indigenous people from the authority of national citizenship and ultimately reduces them to the status of other, rather than our neighbor. Lee Miracle has described Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution as reinforcing colonialism and recognizing Canadian law as accepting colonial authority. I don't disagree, but I wonder if recognizing Indigenous people as neighbors in a collective under the Crown might transform the way that we see the rights of Indigenous people in the entire Canadian Constitution. In this way, Section 35 might not be interpreted as restricting Indigenous people into a colonial box, but actually giving them a unique set of rights to self-determination and sovereignty in addition to the rights they have been granted under the Constitution. This definitely is not how it has been interpreted in the past, and I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily the answer. That being said, I am suggesting that we need to find new ways of conceptualizing our relationship to one another beyond the bounds of and binary language of colonization. And in so doing, accept that there are other ways of understanding the world and our rights and freedoms beyond economic concerns. I'll leave you with a question to consider following Flanagan's contemptuous suggestion that implementing UNDRIP would be like legislating the Sermon on the Mount. What if we were to attempt to legislate the Sermon on the Mount? What would that look like? What would it look like to no longer frame the conversation around an us versus a them, a binary, and instead begin to see Indigenous people as neighbors and actually try to love our neighbors as ourselves? In The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer wrote, "Humanly speaking, we could understand and interpret the Sermon on the Mount in 1,000 different ways. Jesus knows only one possibility: simple surrender and obedience, not interpreting it or applying it, but doing it and obeying it. While our efforts to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect are bound to fail, what might it look like to move from interpretation and application to actually doing? To greet more than our own people, to pray for those we recognize we have harmed, and to not look at Indigenous people with shame and pity, but with the love reserved for those we have the utmost respect."